Rise up!
This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the USA Today NFL Wire site covering the Arizona Cardinals. My co-host, as always, is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site, and also one of the hosts of the original Draft Breakdown podcast in its rebooted format with Justin Higdon. And they are offering a different type of format. They've got one free show every week you can find on all the podcast platforms, and then they offer as well a bonus episode during the week through Patreon. If you choose to become a patron that way. But we are here, episode 304, in the second of our traditional our yearly three draft preview shows. Our last episode last week, we went through the offensive. It was an extended episode. It was more than the best hour of Cardinals talk. It was the best hour and a half of Cardinals talk on the web. We talked offensive prospects, talking about all the different position groups. And we're going to do the same again tonight, only we're going to turn to the defensive side of the ball, as well as kind of talk about and break down the names that are most commonly connected with the Cardinals in the first round in terms of mock drafts. But Seth, tell us what's going on the podcast. I know you guys recorded one earlier this week. I already listened to it. It's a good one, especially for Cardinals fans who are interested in the cornerback position.
Yeah, this week we had another guest on, Kyle Posey of Niners Nation and SB Nation. Overall, he does a lot with SB Nation, and he is a high school defensive coach, and so we had him on to kind of break down defensive backs and the cornerback position especially. We looked at the top guys in the draft and kind of where they fit, and so when and then we went through our 1 through 5 guys. Kyle actually gave his top 15 guys, so it was pretty interesting. And then later on this week, Justin and I'll break down our top 5 linebackers, off-ball linebackers, and then top 5 safeties this year in the draft. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, especially for Cardinals fans, I'd highly recommend the free show this week, like I did last week with the offensive line. We try to know a lot, and then we try to be very open to guys that know even more than us. And the week before, Sully talking offensive line, and then this week, Kyle discussing the cornerbacks, and you'll learn. You'll hear some lingo and some jargon, but you'll learn some things that maybe don't get discussed quite enough about these players, and something that Jess and I will try to kind of talk about a little bit tonight from even what we learned discussing things with Kyle last night.
Well, let's go ahead and get started. We're going to talk first about the names connected, the scenarios connected with the Cardinals. Cornerback is the most common one. There's some offensive linemen, pass rushers, off-the-ball linebackers, if you can believe it. But if we could talk a little bit, because it's happened in a couple of mock drafts. In fact, both by NFL Network's Peter Schrager. He has had the Cardinals trading up. Now, if there's one thing about Peter Schrager that he seems to be really dialed in with the Cardinals. When it came down from the hiring of Cliff Kingsbury, Kyler Murray, if you ever watch Good Morning Football, he's the guy that stands for the Cardinals all the time. He has the guys. So he was all about Dan Arnold. He's all about Kyler Murray, Cliff Kingsbury. He got some cool things from Cliff Kingsbury at one point, and so I think he's got a little bit of insight. And he had his first mock draft had them trading up into the top 10 to select Florida tight end Kyle Pitts. And in the mock draft that was released on Tuesday, today, it was trading up to get one of the Alabama receivers that we're going to talk about, that Jalen Waddle. We're kind of the top candidates. If we want to just, how likely do you see a scenario in which they trade up to get a weapon like Pitts or like Waddle or even Devontae Smith, one of those three big-time playmakers?
You know, I don't know. We've talked about it quite a bit. I just don't know, with the lack of draft capital this year, if they're going to want to sacrifice that, because it's not, it may not be 100% necessary, but it's likely that a team's going to ask for their first and second this year and then something next year. Now, a team may say, no, we'll take a first this year and a first next year, and then maybe something in 2023. So it's just interesting to look at it from that perspective. Would you really want another, how bad do you want one guy to basically be your only day one or two pick? Now, obviously they can make another move, but that's what the question becomes. I'm not opposed to it. I find it hard to believe that Steve Keim, who is draft pick obsessed, would give up picks when he's got so few in this year's draft class. But I mean, if a guy like Kyle Pitts falls that you think is the final piece to the puzzle, then I mean, you can talk me into it a little more. But that's what you'd have to say. A guy like Waddle or Devontae Smith, both guys that I love as prospects, how much are they going to play? Obviously, we've talked about the AJ Green investment. It's not massive, so if he doesn't see the field because Waddle or Smith are better, there's nothing wrong with that. But what happens if you trade for one of those guys and then they end up sitting behind a 32-year-old Green, and then the last year of Christian Kirk or even Andy Isabella?
True, and I like the idea. So, for me, it comes down to, it's not an at all costs situation. There is a price point, and I think for Pitts in particular, it has to be. Pitts is the one in particular because the drop off in talent from Pitts to your next tight end is significant, and it's got to be a price point. What was it? I think it was when I ran a few simulations through on the Draft Network's mock draft simulator, and to get up to number 6, it was exorbitant. It was like the first and the second this year, and the first next year. Well, or maybe like first and second this year, first and second next year. I don't remember. But once you got to like number 8, it was like this year's first and next year's first, and then 9, if he even falls that far, this year's first and next year's second. And at that point, I'm good. I'm content with that. So in both situations, I don't necessarily. So the thing with Waddle or Smith, I do love both of them as well, but you think you might not, if you're going to trade up for it, you probably don't have to quite trade up that far. So it would seem like a little bit extra to have to trade up that high to get one of the receivers. As for Pitts, if you can get him in the 8-9 range, then it's a much more palatable trade. I don't want to trade into the top 10 necessarily for one of the two Alabama receivers, because I think either one would be really, really good here. And I think even if you're desperate to get him, you can probably do that at 11 or 12, when you're giving up maybe next year's third. in addition, or this year's first and next year's third, or this year's first and next year's second. It's something, just so it's more palatable. It's not an all at all cost type situation. Now, if we take the trade thing off, we've got at number 16, kind of, if in my book, there are four ideal players that are, for me, aside from the trading up, it's a best case scenario. Tell me if your best case scenario is the same thing. For me, it comes down to two corners and to two receivers where, honestly, if one of them is there, I'm completely happy. And that would be Waddle, the two Alabama receivers, Jalen Waddle, Devontae Smith, or the cornerbacks, Alabama's Patrick Surtain and South Carolina's J.C. Horn. If any of those four are available, I want the Cardinals to get him. I'm going to wait cornerback a little higher because of the immediacy of the need, but I wouldn't be on, like, if I doubt there will be more than one available of those four, but for me, they're my best case scenario. If everything falls right, one of those guys is there.
Yeah, and I would agree with you. When you look at it from that perspective, the two, probably biggest needs still remaining are corner and wide receiver. We can put tight end in there, but it's just such a one kind of day one class that I don't know if you can really put tight end there right now. So from that perspective, you say, okay, you have cornerback, say that's, need number one, and then wide receiver is need number two. If you can get one of the top five guys, and we'll put the five out there, we feel like it's impossible for them to get Jamar Chase.
we completely ignore that notion, because if Chase is beyond number 6, what is going on?
Right. So if you say, okay, there's five like absolute must have guys, and you say, Chase, Smith, and Waddle, and don't even rank them, just say those five guys, and then Horn and Surtain, that those are the ideal picks. And so in theory, if five quarterbacks go in the top 15, that's 10 players total. You factor in Kyle Pitts, Penei Sewell, and Rashawn Slater, you're at 13. So realistically, you only need 3 players to find your way into that grouping for one of those 5 guys to get there. However, the more you kind of look at it, and even in the Mel Kiper Jr., Todd McShay dueling mock today, they had J.C. Horn somehow getting to the Cardinals at 16, and the likelihood of that is like what, 22% or 28%?
Yeah.
Like, so it's a 1 in 4 chance basically,
which you can live with, which is about what you can expect from any good prospect for the 16th pick.
Right. And so that's when you look at it from that perspective. Yeah, I mean, it sounds about right. If you're going to say, hey, let's just say 4 guys, take Chase out of there. There's 4 guys. Well, 4 divided by 16 is 25. So 25% chance, right? Like you're right there. So that would make sense. It'll be interesting, because I think that's the way you kind of have to look at the draft. You say you have to hope 5 quarterbacks go early, because that just makes it more likely that a guy goes down. Because after that, you do have one guy in Kyle Pitts who's going in the top, I would guess, 10. That's the safest way to put it.
Yeah.
And then you've got 2 offensive linemen that feel kind of like top 15 locks. So, from there, like I said, then it just kind of, you just kind of have to look at what other teams need. Now, the only problem with cornerback becomes, like pass rusher, you can never have enough. So teams could, in theory, look at going cornerback, even if it's not an immediate need. We've talked about like the Denver Broncos, for instance.
It's a premium position, and especially when you've got a defensive head coach like Vic Fangio,
Right.
he's going to want cover guys.
Right. So what? They just went and got Kyle Fuller. It doesn't matter. He'd rather have two Kyle Fullers than one Kyle Fuller, so to speak. So
Right.
So I mean, that's the hard part when you look at it. But ideally, one of those four guys is available at 16 and really makes your draft easy for you, right?
Yes, then it's not just okay, you're thrilled that one of those guys, kind of like last year, it kind of felt like when Steve Keim got to number 8, that if either Derek Brown or Isaiah Simmons was on the board, he was super happy, and it wouldn't have mattered which one of us, whoever it was, that was his pick, and so if one of those four guys is there, but the problem is, and I wrote a mock draft not for Cards Wire but for Sportsbook Wire. Yes, it's the USA Today sports gambling site, and so I wrote a mock draft for Sportsbook Wire, which has some odds kind of mixed in there for kind of the bets that you can make. But I mocked the first round, and the way I had it playing out is even with 4 quarterbacks going with the first 4 picks, those top 4 players were still off the board by the time the Cardinals came around, which then takes us to our next tier of players, where for me, there are a number of players I'm comfortable with, but I'm not excited about. Like I believe they're going to be good, and I think they'll fill needs. So there's a number of players I'm okay with and I'm comfortable with, but none of them are on the same level as those top 4. Let's talk about some of those. I don't want to get too deep because one of them is a cornerback in terms of Caleb Farley, who's been mocked to the Cardinals a number of times. And I want to save more of his talk for when it comes to we talk cornerbacks. But how comfortable would you be with Caleb Farley at number 16? Me, I think I'm more comfortable with him than a lot of the other picks that are possible.
Yeah, Farley's he's just such an injury concern for me. I'm not a huge fan of him at 16. In the podcast on the original Draft Breakdown podcast, I ranked him as my 7th guy, and that wasn't a shot. That's saying I would take him on day 2, all day on day 2. If he's there, I'm more comfortable with him than taking him, at a quote unquote premium pick at 16. So if I can get him at, a trade down and pick up even trade out of the first round and you pick him up, early on day 2, I'm okay with that. Rather than taking him at 16, just because, as I kind of explained to you earlier, it's the injury concern for me.
And then at the same time, another cornerback that not really is getting talked about that high, but he should get in the conversation because of the production, would be Greg Newsome. He also has some durability concerns, but in terms of gameplay, there are some eye-popping numbers. I would be as well comfortable with him because I think he's going to be a really good player. He's not my favorite player, but I would be comfortable with him at 16 because of the immediacy and the long-term need at the cornerback position.
Yeah, and on the podcast last night, Justin brought up the comparison that he's a lot like Kyle Fuller, and that that actually hit home with me pretty well, because when you look at him play and his style and even his build, he does have some Kyle Fuller in him, in that sense. And so for that, I like him. He's my 2nd ranked corner in this class, even in front of Surtain, who's, definitely more the consensus guy. But I prefer Newsome and his athleticism, and athletic upside over Surtain and his, what is without a doubt his, immediacy and ability. But I would be fine with him.
Now we go to the next group. So the receivers, if the top three aren't there, some people have the Cardinals taking, say, a Kadarius Toney. Is there a receiver? Like, honestly, I'm not in love with any receiver that's not those top three or the two Alabama guys at 16 because I don't know. I feel that with the number 16 pick, you want a borderline Pro Bowler, All Pro, ideally, and rather than just a pretty good player. And I don't really feel necessarily that the receivers, which a lot of people say is a really good, but I think they're more specialized than anything else. You guys brought up some of the red flags about Rashad Bateman, Kadarius Toney. So I don't think there is a single receiver I would love at 16 if it's not Waddle or Smith.
Yeah, and I would agree with that. I mean, if they took a guy, I've said it before, I think I would want Terrace Marshall if you're going to take a guy, and he's been getting mocked, kind of back end of round one. So at that point, is there really a difference? Marshall profiles out similar. I'm not saying he's going to be, but similar to AJ Green in terms of style of play and athleticism. He's similar to former LSU wide receiver DJ Chark, who's, been phenomenal for the Jacksonville Jaguars. So when you look at it from that perspective, I would be fine with Marshall over those guys simply just because I think he gives you something in terms of size at 6'3", 205, and then he does have that 4.4 speed, but he also can jump out of the building, which is good for a big guy like that. He would give you a different look opposite of DeAndre Hopkins, which I think would be ideal, but none of those other corners I'm necessarily enthralled with. As you said, it wouldn't be my first choice.
Offensive linemen that have been connected. The most common is Elijah Vera Tucker. He projects to be, many think he'll be a fantastic guard, but versatile enough to be a good tackle. Elijah Vera Tucker. I know you and Blake, who is on the Revenge of the Birds podcast, really like Tevin. You talked about it last week. You like, what's his last name? I forget it now.
Tevin Jenkins.
Jenkins. Come on.
Yeah.
Tevin Jenkins. I totally
I know
blanked the last name.
The first name definitely throws you off because you're like, wait a second. That's
the Tevin Jenkins. You're like, take him.
Easy.
You won't regret it. Then you've got Christian Darrisaw. If he falls, I've seen Christian Darrisaw mocked there. Is there a lineman? Like, I wouldn't love a lineman, but I'd be okay with it. Tevin Jenkins, because the thing is, for me, I don't think there's a lineman that's playing year one, but there is definitely uncertainty at guard at the neck after this season because Justin Murray, Brian Winters, Josh Jones, Justin Pugh. Justin Pugh's not going to be on the team in a year from now. We don't know about Justin Murray. What the thing is, Brian Winters got a 1-year deal. Josh Jones, they can play guard tackle, but they might be talking more guard because they already brought back Kelvin Beachum. So Vera Tucker at 16, if more of a guard, it makes more sense in terms of stability on the line. But Jenkins does give you a more premium position at tackle. Darrisaw, there were concerns that were brought up in your podcast about Darrisaw's effort level. And so I wouldn't love any offensive line, but it does give the right message to your quarterback who believes in adding offensive linemen. That does send the right message to Kyler Murray that they're committed to protecting him.
I would be fine with some offensive linemen. Tevin Jenkins would be ideal. We talked about last week. If for some reason Rashawn Slater was available, he'd be a
home run. He'd be a home run.
and he's a guy that can literally play anywhere. So, you're okay with him. I ideally, I don't think offensive line would be the pick on day one, just because, as you said, you're probably not going to see much of them in this year. However, I do think they're, um, as you said, it would address the long term goal need type of thing. Um, so I don't think there's anything wrong with that pick. I just, like you, I don't love the idea at 16. However, like I said, if it's for me, if it's if it's Tevin Jenkins, you're not going to hear me complain at all. Um, Elijah Vera, I'm a little less
It's not.
excited
It's a
about.
boring pick, honestly.
Well, and he. I mean, I think he's going to be good, but he's very much a finesse player in his style, and so I do wonder if that's ideal for them.
Yeah.
And so whereas Jenkins is the most advanced run blocker thus far, in the class already. So
Say, let's talk pass rushers, and then there's one, and then a couple of linebackers that. So, Kwity Paye, Michigan, athletic freak. Production doesn't necessarily match the athleticism. Then you got Jalen Phillips. I think, of all of the pass rushers, I think he's the one that. Well, that's not necessarily true. Like Azeez Ojulari, I think he also fits in terms of what you want to bring. But Vance Joseph has taken like well-known 4-3 edge rushers and turned them into successful 3-4 outside backers as pass rushers. He did it with Bradley Chubb, and so I'm confident they can do that. But I'm not sold. And I know the Cardinals, they're vice president of player personnel, Drew Gregson, talks about the strength of his edge class. I honestly don't see a high-end edge class. And while Jalen Phillips I'd be okay with, I don't know if I would be moderately excited for Kwity Paye, Jason Owe. There's some upside with the athleticism with these guys, but I'm less. I don't know. I'm less excited about a pass rusher than I think I would normally be in a regular year.
yeah, and I'm a big Phillips guy. He's my top rusher. Um, that being said, same. I wouldn't mind him, but like I said, he's my top guy. But there are concerns with the medical retirement due to concussions. So that's that is a concern that you have to think about. And then when you look at it from the aspect of, so Phillips was my top guy. I believe I have Ojulari as my number two. He's kind of, well, after Phillips, there's really no guy that combines any type of production with his athleticism. You're either talking about straight athleticism, whether it's Ojulari, Kwity Paye, Jason Owa, or you're talking about production and maybe a guy that doesn't have that athletic edge presence that maybe you're looking for more consistently now, like a Greg Rousseau, a Chris Rumpf, who's a day two or three guy. So it'll be interesting to see how this kind of works itself out, because I think overall you're talking just so much about, there's so few players in this class that you look at and go, oh, it would make sense to draft him because he's got so few weaknesses. Whereas that's just not, I mean, it's a weird class in that sense, because usually you have a number of guys that you feel comfortable with, and this year it's just not, you just don't see that.
The other two players would be off the ball inside back for the Cardinals. Micah Parsons, Penn State, and Zaven Collins, an interesting guy that we're hearing information. Pete Prisco had him going to the Cardinals number 16. He's a guy that Seth, you've talked about on the show as one of your favorite prospects in terms of talent. But he's built like a guy that the Cardinals would want to put at outside linebacker. And what we're hearing from people who are hearing things is that the Cardinals kind of like him to be an edge guy when he himself is saying being a forward rushing edge guy, it does not play to his strengths. I'm be okay with Collins because I mean, if you're looking moving forward, he could play that base outside backer, but I think his future is at Jordan Hicks' position, and it'd be super exciting to have Collins and Isaiah Simmons for years to come. That said, I'd be okay, I'd be comfortable with it, but I'm gonna wonder how they're gonna use him.
Yeah, and that's my concern, and I tweeted about that tonight with the Tony Pauline report on Pro Football Network. It's a concern that you have to look at because this team doesn't have a history of necessarily putting together the most consistent path for rookies. And so to take a guy like Zaven Collins, who says his ideal position, and then move him to a position he says, I don't know if that's, would be my best usage. Man, doesn't that seem like...
It seems exactly like what the Cardinals like to do, take a guy and move him.
Right. And so that's, I mean, to me, that's the less than ideal way to look at it. But, it is what it is. So we'll see kind of what happens with that. But I think Collins is going to be a star. So I hate to say you can't mess it up.
But the Cardinals could.
Right, exactly.
All right. We've spent a lot of time on the potential picks. We haven't even delved into the defensive prospects of the draft. So coming up next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web, we're going to start doing that. But we're going to lead with cornerback. We're going to go in this order. We're going to go cornerback, pass rusher, off the ball, linebacker, and then go to safety if kind of in that direction. And that's how we'll lead the show. So coming next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web, we're going to talk cornerbacks, the position arguably of the best of the greatest need. That's coming next on Rise of C-Red. We're back on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best ever Cardinals talk on the web. Cornerbacks, we've delved into that a little bit. So we know some names of guys that are, we don't need to go into great detail. If there's four names that make the most sense, the two, we've talked J.C. Horn, Patrick Surtain. Based on what was on the podcast yesterday on Monday, is that KP really loved J.C. Horn because he kind of does everything well. What's really neat about this class is that this cornerback class has a bunch of sons of former sons of NFL players, which is really nice. J.C. Horn, son of Joe Horn, was a great receiver. Patrick Surtain, who was the son of Patrick Surtain. You've got Asante Samuel Jr., who was the son of Asante Samuel. So you've got some really good bloodlines in this year's cornerback class. It seems that the writers of the internet, the reporters out there, feel that Patrick Surtain is the number one. Horn probably is the overall perfect fit for the Cardinals, but I wouldn't complain about either one. What makes Horn a little bit better than Surtain overall?
I just smoothness and overall athleticism. Surtain's a little tight, and those Bama corners do get a lot more help than a guy like Horn did at South Carolina. Now, to be fair to Surtain, they weren't the Bama defense of old while he was there. So, but they tend to, get a little more help. The other thing with Horn is he comes and plays in a more physical play style. Um, Something, as you alluded to, the Cardinals could use. Not to say that Surtain's not a physical presence or a willing tackler, just something that is not as much of a strength. And then you've got the fact that Horn is a guy that makes a lot of plays on the ball. Um, I think the combination of all of that, he's got some Aqib Talib, like Jalen Ramsey to him. And that's not to say that Surtain is not very good. It's just to say that when you're looking at maybe an alpha kind of cornerback, you're looking at maybe Surtain as like Antonio Cromartie, and then J.C. Horn potentially being, like I said, Aqib Talib or Jalen Ramsey. So you're talking about, a really good borderline Pro Bowl player in Cromartie, or a All-Pro type of player, that, and so you're not far away in terms of abilities. You're just talking about slightly different playing styles and maybe high end output and comps.
You got Newsome, you've got Farley. Was it Tyson Campbell? That was kind of the name that surprised me. I don't know. Kyle said it was his guy. You've got Asante Samuel, Paulson Adebo. You've talked about in terms of just ball production, in terms of pass breakups and interceptions, in terms of targets. Newsome and Adebo were fantastic in terms of that. Newsome, who, yeah, I like the word that he's a nuisance for. He's a guy that causes problems for receivers. What are some, so you feel kind of the 4 day one guys would be Farley, Newsome. If they go further back in the first round, you could get some fringe guys. I've seen Asante Samuel creep up into the first round, which sometimes happens with cornerbacks. But talk day two. So if they don't go cornerback in round one and they go with a receiver or they go with a pass rusher on day two, and then some of the sleepers. On day two, who are some of the other names? We know Paulson Adebo. We know Asante Samuel. Was it? Who was the guy for? Was it Tyson Campbell? Was the name of him?
Yeah, Tyson Campbell. That's Kyle's favorite. He, after J.C. Horn, Campbell's a guy that profiles out really well. First off, he's a special like athlete that you rarely kind of seen in terms of just play speed. He compared him to Marlon Humphrey. When you watch how he plays the game, he is a guy that gets his hands on a lot of balls, but he's also a guy that got beat a lot. And the reason he got beat so much was due to how he tends to take chances. So that's what the question becomes for Campbell. Are you willing to live? Because he's a guy that could be there on day two for the Cardinals if they go a wide receiver on day one. He could be a guy that's there at 49. And for me, I've said that all along. Campbell and Adebo at 49, I love that potential there.
What about guys like Central Florida's Aaron Robinson, or as well, I just blanked, Kelvin Joseph out of Kentucky?
Joseph's an interesting one because he is a transfer from LSU, or sorry, maybe it was Alabama. He was a transfer from a big school. I can't remember which one, to be completely honest right now. I'll look real quick while we're discussing it. But he's a transfer from one of those big schools, and he played.
LSU.
Yeah, LSU. So played on special teams as a freshman and then was suspended, and it had to end up going to Kentucky, and then was good at Kentucky. So the question becomes, you know, one you're you're talking about obviously um, an uber athlete that is going to compete at a high level, that was good enough to go play at LSU. So this isn't a Kentucky guy who played above his head. No, instead, this is a LSU guy who ended up being in trouble and had to go to Kentucky. He played well at Kentucky, but he definitely has some question marks. He has some learning he has to do from a skills standpoint, and then he's got some physical growing. He needs to. He's still a very lean guy, even though he's similar size to like a Greg Newsome at 190 pounds. He's just very lean, but he's a phenomenal athlete. And then on Aaron Robinson, I've gone back and forth on my Aaron Robinson love. He's a top 10 player in this class at the cornerback position. Um, but there's guys that I just prefer, if that makes sense. Robinson's smaller at 5'11, 186, which is, a concern. Great athletic testing at sub 4.4, good broad jump, not a bad vert. But overall, he was, a guy that wasn't, like, from a physical standpoint, you wonder if he can hold up outside because he's 5'11 with short arms, 30-inch arms, which, is a concern when you're already short. So, he's a concern. I would not take him early, but he's a guy that I think is going to be a good player for a long time in the NFL. Again, I think we talked about this a little bit last week. He's kind of your perfect like round 3 corner, and of course they don't have one.
No round 3 pick. So who are some now day 3? Who might be some sleepers? Look, there's some names that are notable to me. One would be Shakur Brown out of Michigan State. Another one, Benjamin St-Juste out of Minnesota. So the Big Ten guys. That where do you see them making an impact? Do you see them becoming starter quality or starting caliber players? Obviously, you're taking day 3. That's not something you expect out of them right away.
No, it's not. When you look at the ability from this class, one of the things that you see quite a bit is that it's a weird class, and I've talked about it a little bit, in that you either have athletic guys or production guys, and so that's why they're available on day 3. Last night, Kyle discussed a kid from, I believe, Illinois. I'm trying to remember what his name was off the top of my head. I can't. That he really likes on day 3, that thinks he's going to be kind of that steal of the draft type of guy. When I find it, I'll let you know. I'm going through my notes right now. There's some other guys that I've
Nate
talked
Hobbs?
to. Yeah, Nate Hobbs, that he really likes. So, that's a name to kind of just put in your back pocket, talking about him as a potential day 3 guy. A guy that I like on day 3, but I'm wondering if he's going to go way earlier, is Eric Stokes out of Georgia. He is a world-class sprinter, like literally world-class. But he's kind of plays like a sprinter. Like, he's a very linear, straight line athlete. If you got him on day 3, if they ended up with the 4th round pick somehow, I think he would be a nice fit. I don't know how they're going to do or add that, something that we've talked about quite a bit is, can they add picks to get guys that fit into that role? Then there was a guy out of Texas Tech. I think McPherson's his name. Yeah, Zach McPherson is another one of those day 3 guys. To kind of know, again, similar size to like Aaron Robinson I talked about, but you're getting him on day 3. So that's kind of the difference. He's not quite as explosive as Robinson, but he's a guy that had decent production, lined up outside quite a bit in the Big 12, and we know that they like to throw the football a lot there. So he's not a top end guy by any means, but he's a good one. And then the last one, Diamador Lenore is a guy I talked about last night. He's kind of a tweener. It's going to be interesting to see where he lines up, because I think teams will like him as kind of a Jimmy Ward type of guy that plays that safety / nickel. And you and I've discussed that maybe that's what they're looking for is a nickel slot guy, where they're willing to move Byron Murphy outside if need be. So that's the question on that one. When you look at this class, I think there's going to be a lot of good choices that they can make. And I don't think they can go wrong in any round, even on day 3, where you're talking maybe 5th round guys like McPherson or Hobbs or Lenore. So you're talking comfort level with a Horn or Surtain, or a Newsome at 16, maybe even a Farley if you're comfortable with his medicals, and then an Adebo or a Campbell at 49, and then you've got guys at that. I think the next pick is 160. If they don't make any moves that you can be comfortable with that we just discussed.
Coming up next on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on and talk about the pass rushers. Let's discuss that a little bit. That's coming up next on Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Pass rushers. We talked a little bit about those pass rushers in the first round. Jalen Phillips, Kwity Paye. You've got Azeez Ojulari. You've got Greg Rousseau. You've got, there's another one I can't, though, Jason Owe. What do we look at in terms of guys that might be there in round 2, who might be there at 49, and then some sleepers at the back end? Apparently, the Cardinals like the edge class, but it doesn't feel like, right now, it doesn't feel like you're going to find, because historically, your great pass rushers are pretty much all first-round picks. Now we're starting to see a little more diversity in terms of where they're selected, but they're not there aren't premier pass rushers over an entire career. They're guys that you'll get some big years and some less than great years. In round 2, the one name that I think you've brought up before is Joseph Osai out of Texas. Is there anyone else of note?
I like Carlos Basham, but it feels like his name's moving up quite a bit from Wake Forest. He's another kind of big edge guy, 6'3", 270. Had a decent workout, 4.64, 40, 4.25 shuttle, which was, good for him. And then he had a good broad jump at 122 inches. So, athletic enough type guy. Production-wise, it was good. It wasn't great by any means, but that's what we've talked about. This edge class doesn't really put together a guy that produced and a guy that's got elite athleticism. So Basham's a guy that maybe, but I'm seeing him kind of slowly work his way into the top 40. So that might be slightly out of the Cardinals' range there. You mentioned Osai, same type of thing. I mean, he's all of a sudden you're seeing him mentioned as a maybe a top 40 pick. And so it'll be interesting to see where he falls because he's definitely like part of the get off the bus team. Like you look at Joseph Osai and you're like, oh, that dude's a football player, right? Like he's cut, he's athletic, he's physical, but he's never really put it all together to become a complete pass rusher. Um, so that'll be again another interesting one to kind of follow along. Um, Really, I don't think there's any other day two guys, even if they had a third round. I mean, this is just an interesting draft class, and something that we've talked about is that there's just not a ton of guys that warrant early round picks. There's a bunch of guys that I think have a chance to have some production in the NFL, but they just haven't put it together enough to um, qualify or really interest you at pick 49. If for some reason, like an Ojolari or an Owe fell out of the first round, um, maybe those guys fit the profile, but I just, because there is such a lack or, a dearth of that talent, I just don't see it happening.
Day three, guys. Are there anybody worth noting? Pass rushers on day three are kind of, they're rare that you get production out of day three. I know the one that I've had a guy ride on a couple times, Chris Rumpf out of Duke. There's some edge guys at Pitt. I think there's two or three of them.
Yeah, Richard Weaver and something Jones, can't remember off the top of my head, are both interesting day three guys. Quincy Roche is the third guy from Miami. It's crazy to think that they could have three pass rushers drafted in this draft. Roche is kind of a different one at 6'3", 250. He's a little bit more of like a short and squatty, and obviously I don't mean that uh, as an insult. He, again, testing wise, it's fine. Good short area quickness. Um, but again, production wise, he's got one big season and two kind of seasons. So that's where, you look at and you find him maybe at pick 160. Um, Hamilcar Rashed is a guy you and I have talked about, I believe, on the show. If not, we've talked about him off the show.
My word, his production in 2019 was insane. And 2020, what happened? Now, we talked about the fact that 2020 was a weird year for the Pac-12. And it probably would have, based on what he saw, opting out would have been good because he would have been, I'm sure, a first-round pass rusher because he's got length, he's got production. But yeah, he could be and he's a kid that went to high school in Arizona, so we would continue with that trend of the Arizona high school pipeline ending up on the team.
A guy that I have not watched, but I've been told is a name to know. And so this is always dangerous, but actually there's two of them. Ellerson Smith is a guy from northern Iowa, 6'7", 250. So
I've ran across him he's a guy I've used on day three of some mocks, some draft simulations, and what he projects to, like, he'd be a good situational kind of, not necessarily the Dennis Gardeck because he's longer than Dennis Gardeck, but kind of has the potential to be one of those super productive in limited playing time early in his career.
Yeah, and then the other one would be Jordan Smith. Another kind of, he's out of UAB. Again, another kind of super long guy, 6'6", 264. Again, you're talking about 5th, 6th, 7th round type of guys. there's a reason they're down there. Their lack of production, they may not have the best metrics, but they've been, had some success. They've played well at times, um, and they've got some, again, day three skills that you look for in those things.
All right. Coming up next on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the inside linebacker position so we can discuss it. There's some interesting names there after round one. That's coming next on Rise Up C Red. We're back on the Rise Up C Red podcast, the best of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move on to the off the ball backers, which for the Cardinals means inside linebacker, where the starting lineup's fine. They've got Jordan Hicks, they've got Isaiah Simmons, and they've got Tanner Vallejo, but they don't really have an answer beyond this season. And Hicks is likely going to be playing his final season with the Cardinals this year based on his contract redo. So you've got Zaven Collins, you've got Micah Parsons at the top of the first round. If you want to go smaller, kind of your Deon Buchanan style build, you've got Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah. Any of those, like we talked about Collins, I think we kind of glossed over Parsons because we don't suspect that he's going to be available at 16. He would be, as long as you can get over the hazing thing for his freshman year. If that is vetted, he and Simmons be really, really, like, same thing with Collins, only Parsons isn't as ginormous as Collins. One thing, the way someone described him on Twitter, it's like watching on a video game where he is just a giant. Like, he's a created player that is 2 times the size of everyone else on the field. Parsons has the athleticism, the production. Everyone that I've in terms of playing the inside backer position or the off-ball linebacker, that he's going to be a stud, and there's nothing stopping him.
Yeah, Parsons is kind of your can't-miss guy of this draft. I say the same thing about Collins, but Parsons is more of a pure linebacker, if you will. If Parsons somehow fell to 16, that would be kind of an interesting fit, because we've talked about how much this team has invested at the inside linebacker position, but it could be one of those situations where it's just too good of an opportunity to pass up. So maybe you go with Parsons because he's the best player that fell, to that area. From there, it gets interesting because I think the next guy is probably going to be JOK, like he talked about, out of Notre Dame. I don't know if the Cardinals can afford to get another one of those guys, though. I don't think he can play with Isaiah Simmons. You'd be incredibly athletic out there. You don't have a natural inside linebacker that it loves to take on blockers. You have 2 guys that excel in running and chasing more than anything else. So from that perspective, I just don't know if JOK is the fit. Jamin Davis out of Kentucky is another interesting one. For a time, I thought he was going to be available at 49. I just don't see it now. I think he's going to end up going kind of back end of round 1. He is another one of those kind of uber athletic framed guys that could end up being, the playmaker of this class. 6'3", 235, ran a 4.3, 740, had a 42-inch vertical and a 132-inch broad jump. Like, he's legitimately a freak of nature. And then he's played the linebacker position and done it really well. He's not a coverage guy, which is one of the big kind of question marks about him, but he is a downhill guy that has a lot of success working downhill, something that, like I said, could be a fit next to Isaiah Simmons. Again, I just don't think he's going to be there. And then I had Baron Browning as my number 5 guy, another athletic freak of nature that does a lot of things at Ohio State. You look at him and you see a guy that is going to be a productive day 2 linebacker for a long time in the NFL. Couple guys, Justin Light, Buddy Johnson out of A&M. I don't know if he fits. Again, he's a bit undersized at 6 feet 230. Not sure that he's going to be the ideal partner next to Isaiah Simmons, and that's kind of what you have to look at when you're looking at linebackers. One name to know that I like, little undersized, but he doesn't know it, and that's probably why he's not going to be around forever, is Isaiah McDuffie out of Boston College. 6'1", 230, ran well enough, 4.59 guy. The rest of it was just okay, but another kind of downhill guy that loves the physicality. He's not as athletic as Dennis Gardeck, but his style of play reminds me of Dennis Gardeck, where he really likes to bring the physicalness to the opposing player. He's a guy that you could be looking at like a pick 160, and we know that they love those guys that look like special teams, kind of fill in early, and then you go from there.
What do you think? What do you think of Nick Bolton out of Missouri?
I'm not a huge Bolton fan. He plays a little bit like JOK does, but he's not as athletic as JOK. He's a straight line, kind of linear guy. Here's what I said. He and McDuffie actually remind me of similarity in kind of how they play, but one of them I could get at, one of them I would have to probably take at 49, and one of them I could take at 160 or even in the 6th round.
Anybody else of note at linebacker?
I did forget to mention one edge player that I had written down. Joe Tryon out of Washington is a guy to know at 49. He could be an edge kind of fit for this team and what they need. I don't know if they're going to be looking edge, but he's the one guy at 49 outside of maybe a Carlos Basham that we haven't heard going up into round 1 quite yet.
Coming next on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the interior of the defensive line. Not considered a strong class, but still some options there later on in the draft. That's coming on next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Let's move to the interior of the defensive line. So your defensive lineman, defensive tackle, nose tackle. It isn't a strong class. Alabama's Christian Barmore is pretty much considered maybe the only defensive interior defender who might get drafted in the 1st round. And he certainly won't be under consideration for the 16th pick, probably. But there are some solid. So, assuming that's coming off the board, and to me, didn't we talk a little? I can't remember if we talked about on the air or off the air. Barmore is a little Robert Kimdichie-ish, right? The production wasn't. He had some monster games, especially in the postseason. But the kind of the reputation he has is he's a gap jumper, not super disciplined, but he can flash, which reminds me a lot of Robert Kimdichie, who never quite got it together and then got hurt.
Yeah, and Barmore's an interesting case because from a size perspective, I've said his high-end comparison reminds me of like a Stephon Tuitt. Is that a guy you would take at 16? I don't think it is. So ideally you would get a guy like him at 49, but because of the, again, dearth of talent at that position in this class, he's a guy that I think ends up going in that kind of 23 to 35 range. I know that's a big 12 pick span, but like that's where I would see him going. In any other class, he'd probably be available at 49, and you're comfortable grabbing him there. So, it'll be interesting to see where he goes. Like you said, the motors run hot and cold. It's run hot at the right time. Um, I mean, nobody can knock what he did in the college football playoffs. It was really, really impressive, and he was a man amongst boys. Um, but that does beg the question: why wasn't that how you played all the time, right?
Right.
Like if you've got that ability, why is that not turned on all the time? Because he was absolutely dominant and deserved to be, one of the best players, you know, on the field, and win all the defensive player of the game awards he did win. Um, my favorite player in this class is Alan McNeil. He's kind of a explosive two-way nose guard in the Javon Hargrave type of athlete. 6'1", 320. Um, had a really good combine, 27 reps on the bench, ran a 4.94, and then he jumped well, again for 320 pounds. So it's one of those situations where he's a guy that the Cardinals could potentially use, but let's be honest, are they going to take a nose tackle at 49? I just don't see it happening.
The defensive line is intriguing to me because of who they added. They got J.J. Watt. They added Jordan Phillips last year. And they drafted 2 defensive linemen each of the last 2 years. So they got Rashard Lawrence and Lecky Fotu, Zach Allen, and Michael Dogby. Now, Dogby is by no means a lock for this roster. It might be where they kind of ignore, but it's interesting because some of my favorite defensive linemen, I don't know if they'll last all the way to round 5, and there's probably not. I don't know if he'd be there. It's probably too rich at round 2, but UCLA's Osa Idijizua, he's fun. Having watched the Pac-12, that's kind of what I do. He is super disruptive. I like, and there's 3 guys in the Pac-12 I like. You've got him. You've got Levi Onwuzurike out of Washington, and he's got some explosiveness to him because he's 290 pounds and ran the 40 in 4.85, 30-inch vertical, and this is at 6'3", 290. So that's a big dude. Not as big as USC's Jay Tufele, who is, he's 6'2", 305. Still ran the 40 under 5 at 4.97. I kind of like those guys, but I just like the 4th round is the sweet spot for the defensive lineman. Do you think any of those guys were around in round 5?
Probably not those guys. I see those guys going right in between the end of round 2 and the beginning of round 4. I think you're going to see a run on these guys because, as you said, they all kind of fit what they need. Milton Williams is another guy tested out of this world. I'd have a hard time accepting the Cardinals taking him at 49, but from a purely testing standpoint, he's literally the closest thing we've ever seen to Aaron Donald. Again, from an athletic testing standpoint, played at Louisiana Tech, and for 5 games, the final about 5 games of that season, he looked like Aaron Donald on the field. But again, we go back to Christian Barmore. Like, I'm sorry, but the final 5 games, I can't draft you, at 49. And so he's probably going to go in that same range. 2 names that I think could potentially be in play in the 5th round. And that's, again, where the Cardinals have that next pick, because the guys you mentioned, all really good potential starting guys in year 2 as pros. And one other name to throw in there is Tommy Togiai from Ohio State. Like, all those guys are going to go in that 60 to 100 range. And that's just the unfortunate reality of this this draft class is that a lot of these guys fit where the Cardinals don't have picks. Tyler Shelvin is a guy I'm not, because he's a nose tackle only. I just don't know where teams can take him. 6'2" and a slim, trim, 350 pounds. Played at LSU. He is your prototypical run stopping nose tackle. If you can get him at 160, I think that is ideal, right? To get a guy that's going to play 35-40% of the snaps there, I feel like would be ideal. And then again, kind of a late round flyer type of guy that I like, that very many people will not like, and that's because he's built like, well, me. Darius Stills out of Virginia, or West Virginia, sorry. 6 feet, 275 pounds, but he plays nose tackle. His
What?
game, yeah, I'm not joking. He's 6 feet, 275 pound nose tackle. He reminds me, the way he plays is similar to Darnell Dockett. Now, I'm not saying he's Darnell Dockett by any means, but he plays in that similar way. He's got really, really good burst off the line. He ran a 7.23 cone, which is like 92nd percentile for his size, and he jumped really well. 33-inch vertical, again, at his size, is actually really crazy. But you're talking about an anomaly. So you're talking about a guy in one of those 2 7th-round picks. That's where you're looking at him at. You're not looking at him, any sooner than that. But, I try to guess on guys, and Stills is a guy that I like and that I think could fit into what the Cardinals like to do in their attacking kind of front defensively.
Coming next on the Rise of C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. One position group left to talk about, and that's at safety. That's coming up next, Rise Up C-Red. We're back on the Rise Up C-Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Safety. Kyle Posey did not like this safety class. There are kind of some different thoughts on it. There are guys, so one who's getting some love I've seen in mock drafts going as high as the middle of the 1st round, even going like at number 14 to the Minnesota Vikings, is TCU's Trevon Moehrig. And Kyle did not really like him because he basically saying he doesn't do any of the things well that you want a safety to do. Do you feel the same way about the safety class that is really sort of
Yeah, I'm not a huge fan of it. And I'll be honest, and I talked about this last night on the Patreon podcast. I didn't watch a ton of it till late because I just look at the Cardinals and I'm like, well, they're not going to draft a safety.
Right. I mean, you've got Budda Baker, they really like Jalen Thompson, and even beyond that, I still think that they kind of believe that Deontay Thompson, DT, can be something as a kind of a starter. But
and then they brought back Chris Banjo. They signed Sean Williams. Like, the outside of quarterback, the only other room that doesn't make a whole lot of sense is safety.
And day 3 for me, that's the sweet spot because then you can get a special teams guy.
Yeah, and so there's a couple guys that I do like. I talked about, again, so if you want to be a patron, it's $2 a month. It's nothing out of this world, but I'll tell you on here too because I like you guys. One name to know is Divine Diablo, and no, I'm not making that up.
I love the names. My favorite.
He played at Virginia Tech. He is basically a linebacker. Like, he's the opposite of everything the Cardinals ever do. Like, he is a linebacker in a safety body. 6'3", 226 pounds, but he is incredibly athletic. I feel like that would be an ideal kind of 6th-round type of pick. Now, the question is, does he get there? Because at 6'3", 226, that, running I think he ran a 4.42 40. Like there's going to be a lot of teams that are like, oh, we can get the most out of him. But if you can get him on day 3, round 5, I think he would be kind of ideal to be that, safety that you have in the system, but also an immediate special teams contributor. From there, there's some guys that I'm just interested in. I'm kind of following where they go. It's not that I don't like them. It's just I'm only going to take them in certain areas. Javon Holland is one of them. I'm not sure where he goes. I like Richie Grant out of UCF, but again, I don't. Where does he go? The guy I talked about quite a bit last night, Jamar Johnson out of Indiana, he's projected to go on day 2. I would not, and not that he's a bad player by any means. I actually think he's the best safety in this class. I just don't know if I want to take a safety at 49, right? Like,
right.
With so many other needs on this team, but he's, incredibly, fluid and in the way he plays the game. He actually reminds me a lot of Tony Jefferson, like just that natural safety that understands where to be and how to get there. He's a little more athletic than Tony was, just on the numbers, but we all know that didn't matter for Tony. He made plays all over the field all the time.
A name that perhaps know whether he's a guy that gets drafted on day 3 or a priority free agent. They have met with Auburn safety Jordan Peters, got some athleticism to him. Didn't like his 40 wasn't that great. It was in the 4.6s, I think, but with a 39.5-inch vert, 10 foot 4-inch broad jump, and he blocked 5 kicks in college. So that he's not the super athletic, the uber athletic. He's got some athleticism, but he was great on special teams in college. That might be a guy you might see added on late. So perhaps a 6th or 7th round guy.
Yeah, and that's the thing. Again, when we're discussing safeties, we're kind of assuming that we're looking at guys like Caden Stearns out of Texas that, ran a sub 4.40 and that jumped out of the building. Okay, so this is a athletic freak at 6 foot, 205 pounds. Obviously didn't make a ton of plays in college, and there's a reason why he is, not being talked about even in the first 2 days of the draft. But he's got elite athleticism and could probably be a key special teamer. And that's what I've talked about before. That's what you're looking for in safeties coming out. Either guys that you see down the line can be contributors or guys that can contribute immediately on special teams.
Any other guys to know at safety?
Not off the top of my head, really, because again, this is a class where you're probably going to see them going when the Cardinals aren't picking, or when you and I wouldn't want to see the Cardinals making a pick at safety.
So with that, we will wrap up this edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. We will be back again in a week. Next week's show, heading into the NFL draft week, we will run our mock draft. We will mock the first round of the draft, see how we do. And then the week after that, of course, it will be breaking down what the Cardinals did in the draft. So we've got 2 shows coming in the next 2 weeks. And then after that, things start to get a little bit slower. But this is the Rise of Sea Red podcast. I'm Jess Root. That's Seth Cox. Thanks for listening. As always, we'll be back again next week. Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up Sea Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms, so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red Sea Red, and of course, Rise Up Sea Red.